And now for the second part of our discussion, let's talk about the different modes of inheritance. When it comes to the different modes of inheritance, some of which are actually following the concept that was stated at the golden ratio that was mentioned by Gregor Mendel. But there are a lot of modes of inheritance that are actually present across different types of species. And when it comes to these modes of heredity or of inheritance, let's simply consider every single one of them. The first one, we have the presence of complete dominance. For complete dominance, it is actually the mode of inheritance very much common among alleles present on different organisms, both for plants and animals. So, for instance, complete dominance, one of the best examples for the complete dominance, it is actually the presence of the 7 traits that are present among pea plants. That the dominant trait will always mask the recessive trait, even if that characteristic or that gene is actually in heterozygous, the dominant trait would simply be manifested, just like the presence of our examples earlier, the presence of hybrid purple flower, that even though it is in heterozygous, it will still possess the phenotype or the color that is color purple, which is the dominant trait. While the recessive trait will only be available or present if it is in homozygous. This follows actually the law of dominance that was set by Gregor Mendel. Now, if we're going to follow the law of dominance among humans, there are different types of traits that are actually considered as complete dominance. For instance, the presence of dimples. The presence of dimples, it is actually a dominant allele, while the absence of dimples, it is recessive. Then, just like what is present on the illustration, the presence of widow's peak, or the presence of the peak that is actually present on your forehead, this is actually an example of a dominant allele, while the recessive allele, it is now the presence of straight hairline. While when it comes to the earlobes, the presence of free earlobe is the dominant trait or the dominant allele, while the recessive allele, it is now the presence of attached earlobe. Now, other than the presence of complete dominance, there is also the presence of incomplete dominance. Now, incomplete dominance, it is now the mode of inheritance in which a mixture or the intermediate trait of the dominant and the recessive trait is manifested on an individual possessing the heterozygous gene. Or, it is now the intermediate, the mixture of characteristics that is actually present. And, other than the ones that are actually present on your module, just like the presence of a snapdragon, among humans, we are actually possessing here incomplete dominance when it comes to the texture of our hair. Straight hair is actually the recessive trait, the curly hair is the dominant trait, while the intermediate of these alleles are now known as the wavy hair. As you can observe, the straight is the recessive, the curly is the dominant, but the wavy, it is just a mixture of the characteristics that is actually present on this phenotype. Okay? That's the thing about incomplete dominance. It is just the mixture. Then, for the codominance, it is not the mode of inheritance in which there are more than one dominant allele that can be manifested by a specific gene. If this dominant trait is present on either copy of the gene, both of the traits would be manifested. It will not mix nor be masked by the other. Now, the best example for codominance, it is the presence of the ABO blood type. But in the case of the ABO blood type, well, it is not actually ABO but rather AB0. Since for you to have blood type A, you're actually possessing here a dominant antigen A. Then, if you are blood type B, you are now possessing here the dominant antigen B. Then, codominance would be manifested by people possessing blood type AB, that they are possessing both antigens A and antigen B. Then, for the people with blood type O or blood type 0, we are not actually possessing any antigens. I, for one, is an example of a person possessing blood type O. My red blood cells isn't actually possessing any type of antigens. Okay, so basically that is the reason why blood type O could simply be considered as the universal donor. Okay? Because they are not possessing any antigens. They could give blood and it would be accepted by other blood types. But when it comes to the concept of the recipient, they are now considering here the antibodies. Okay? But please take note that the dominant trait that we are considering here, it is now the presence of the antigens and the glucose that is actually attached on the exterior of these red blood cells. When it comes to the blood type A, on their plasma, they're actually possessing here anti-B antibodies. Or basically, blood type A cannot receive bloods which are possessing antigen B. Okay? While in the case of blood type B, they cannot accept blood which is now possessing antigen A. While in the case of blood type AB, they do not actually possess any antibodies on their blood. So basically, they can receive any blood because those antibodies are not present and they would not bind, they would not create any type of shock when it comes to the blood of that individual. Then when it comes to blood type O, they are now possessing both anti-A and anti-B antibodies. So basically, blood type O, even though we are considered as the universal donor, we can only receive blood from blood type that is the same to us, which is blood type O. And I am actually encouraging everyone, if you reach the age of 18 and you are 50 kilograms and above, you can actually donate blood every 3 months. So, hashtag donate blood, save lives. Because in my case, I am actually a regular blood donor. Okay, it is better to give than to receive, specifically when it comes to blood. Okay, so now let's move forward. Other than the presence of the complete, incomplete, and codominance, we also have here the presence of the autosomal traits. Autosomal traits, these are actually present on the genes which are located on the autosomes or the non-sex determining chromosomes. Basically, for us humans, it is actually present on chromosome 1 to 22. So once again, us humans, we are actually possessing 23 pairs of chromosomes. Chromosome 1 to 22, it actually determines here the different characteristics that is actually present in our body that's not sex related. Okay? Or it is not related with the different hormones, the different characteristics that give us that masculine or feminine physique. It can actually follow any of the aforementioned modes of inheritance. Autosomal traits could be manifested in a form of complete dominance, just like the presence of freckles, the presence of the widow's peak, the presence of attached or free earlobe, the presence of whorls or puyo. Those are the different types of autosomal traits which are possessing complete dominance. While in the case of the incomplete dominance, for instance, the presence of our hair, then when it comes to the codominance, it is now the presence of obviously our blood type. Now in this particular example, there's actually albinism. Albinism, the presence of the albino gene, it is actually an example of an autosomal trait. Specifically, autosomal recessive. Because for you to have albinism, both of your parents should actually be possessing the albino gene that is simply passed down to you. Then, if we have the autosomes or the autosomal traits, we also have here the presence of the sex-linked traits. Now, when it comes to the sex-linked traits, I actually provided different examples of the sex-linked traits, both the dominant and recessive on your module. But for general discussion and for general consumption, sex-linked traits, these are actually the genes that are found on the sex-determining chromosomes of a species. So, for humans, these are present on the 23rd pair of chromosome. Specifically, they are embedded in our X chromosome on the 23rd pair. Because there are actually very few characteristics that are actually present on the Y chromosome since it is only present among men. Okay? Among males. One of the examples of the sex-linked trait, it is the presence of hemophilia. Now, the normal clotting process or the presence of the clotting factor is that once any part of your body is damaged, the clotting process would continue until it totally closed that wound. While in the case of the hemophilia, or some of the clotting factors do not actually bind well when it comes to the other clotting factors that are actually present on your blood, simply because of the absence of different types of proteins that are necessary for blood clotting. The reason why the presence of hemophilia, or also known as the bleeder's disease, is abundant when it comes to different generations and different families, it is actually attributed with the presence of the sex-linked traits, specifically on the X chromosome. Okay, it is more common among males since males are actually possessing only one X chromosome and the other is Y chromosome. While for the females, for them to have hemophilia, they should actually possess homozygous X that is actually present on their genes. And I am actually going to attach more discussions that is actually related with hemophilia on our Google Classroom for this particular discussion. Then, after the sex-linked traits, there's also the presence of epistasis, or it is now the mode of inheritance where genes can interfere the presence and absence of a certain type of trait. Now, as you can observe here, there are actually different types of characteristics that are actually present on the fur and the mane of any organism. For instance, we have here the presence of mice. Now, the presence of the agouti mice, it is actually being considered by one type of trait, while the color of their fur is actually present on another type of trait. So basically, different characteristics and different colors can be manifested because these different types of characteristics were affected by different types of genes. Okay? The agouti color, the presence of black fur, and the presence of albino or no color at all. And this actually summarized on your module how epistasis happened when it comes to these organisms. Now, moving forward, we also have here the presence of the polygenic inheritance. Polygenic inheritance, it is actually an example of a continuous inheritance, or the presence of traits are not binary. They are more than two types of manifestations. For instance, the best example for this is actually height, skin complexion, even eye color could be considered as a polygenic inheritance. Because obviously there is now the manifestation of more than two alleles, and it is actually affected by a lot of genes that is actually present on that individual. The reason why we are possessing different height. Now, after polygenic inheritance, there's also the pleiotropy. Pleiotropy is now the mode of inheritance that can be affected by a single gene. And epistasis is one of its examples. Okay? And pleiotropy is actually related with the lethal alleles, which are the reason why some organisms do not actually reach maturity. They do not reach sexual maturity, and some of them actually suffer or they just basically die at a very young age. Lethal alleles can cause drastic changes in the physiology of an individual. Just like in this particular example, the presence of sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia, it is actually an example of a mutation that is present on the hemoglobin. If the hemoglobin is not actually possessing the globular form because of some changes when it comes to its proteins, the abnormal hemoglobin would actually stick with one another, creating now a very rigid structure and possessing now a sickle shape, which is very sticky, which can cause plaque buildup when it comes to our blood vessels, which can result to heart attack, the presence of stroke, and other types of diseases that is related with our heart, with our cardiovascular system. So, other than the presence of sickle cell anemia, there's also the presence of the cystic fibrosis, which is also an example of a lethal allele. Then, lastly, the last mode of inheritance that we're going to talk about is now all about the environmental factors. Due to the presence of various adaptation and mutation present among genes of organisms, some of the phenotypes manifested by these genes are affected by the conditions present in the environment. Best example for such it is the presence of the Siamese cat. The Siamese cat, if you're actually going to observe here, there are actually two types of coloration that is present on its fur. It is actually being controlled by the environment. This is how the fur of the Siamese cat is actually adapting. If the temperature is above 33 degrees Celsius, no pigment would actually be present on the fur of the cat. Or the tyrosinase would be inactive, which is the protein that is responsible for the production of the pigment on cats. Specifically on Siamese cats, okay? Then, if the temperature is now below 33 degrees, the tyrosinase is active and dark pigment would be available. And so if we're going to observe this, if you are actually taking care of a Siamese cat during the cold seasons, okay, specifically whenever the amihan or the northeast monsoon is very prevalent in our country, their fur is actually darker than during summer. That is actually an adaptation that is present when it comes to these cats, simply to conserve the temperature that is present in their body. It is more on thermoregulation. That's the adaptation that is actually present when it comes to these organisms, specifically on this breed of cat. So there are actually different types of modes of inheritance that are actually present across different types of species. And if we're going to consider this, how are we going to apply these different types of modes of inheritance when it comes to the concept of genetic probability, which would be our discussion for the next video presentation.